I will give an introduction. I'm Mike Juran. I'm the CEO of Altea. We are a software company headquartered here in Colorado Springs. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But yeah, we're in a webinar called Sales 101. So if that's where you expect to be, that's where you are. How's that one?
Yep, perfect. We can see cars and motorcycles.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so, we do user interfaces and a software development platform for companies that make these kinds of products. In fact, these are products that Altea is already in, and we're in about 120 million vehicles and devices around the world right now, driving on the road or in your house. And we are headquartered in Colorado Springs. We have a pretty significant office in Detroit, and we are incorporated in Frankfurt, so we have an Altea GmbH. We're incorporated in Seoul with an Altea Limited, and in Japan with an Altea KK. I tell you this not because you necessarily care who we are or what we do, but I want to set the context for the stuff that I'm talking about is relative to who we are as a company. It's going to be different to who you are as a company, but it helps for you to know where we sit before you know kind of where we stand. And it gives you a little bit of sense of what's gonna, why I have certain sales issues that maybe you don't, but also why I do. Okay. A little bit on the backstory. Altea was actually started in 1991, and these are the four founders, of which I'm one of them in there. And we are kind of a typical early mid-90s tech startup, which is a lot different than I think what I'm seeing here, in that we were all engineers, software engineers, and that poses really unique problems for starting and running a company. But it's interesting. I think I suspect you guys, is this required reading per car in?
We've talked about it, but it's not required reading. It's one of Vance's required readings, but not mine.
Yeah, yeah. So you might consider that as required reading. But one of the things it says is that on average, the age of a unicorn founder is 34, and the average number of co-founders is 3. And in addition, most successful founder CEOs have a technical background. So in some of these tech companies, there's a component to that. There's also a really big downside when you've got a technical background. And I will talk about that, which is also why I'm here to tell you about what we're calling Sales 101. For me and our company, it's really sales for techies and engineers. Now, many of you have a marketing background, a business background. You might even have some sales experience prior to coming here. And that's great, but I think you'll hear a lot of things that kind of resonate. And especially since I think all of you are software companies, you're going to be working with engineers, you're going to have engineers out front and center, and you're going to discover some weaknesses in how they sell, and what you're going to need to fill in the gaps. So I've subtitled this, I hate selling and negotiation, and how can I avoid it at all costs? And that's pretty much what drove my life for many, many years. And the answer to that question is actually pretty straightforward. So how to avoid selling? Well, there's 3 simple steps. The first one is build a platform. Second one is routinely collect recurring revenue every month. And then the third one is sell your company and start a charitable foundation. So if you do that, then you can avoid ever asking anyone for money or selling and becoming a salesperson. 2 of the books to achieve this, I showed you one called Exponential Organization. The other one is Platform Revolution. You can see I have poured through every single page of these and also earmarked them and refer to them quite often. And there's lots of great ways to get to a point where you really don't have to sell. It sort of sells itself. The algorithm sells your software, and you truly are just collecting recurring revenue over time. Now, in the meantime, and in many cases, I've heard this from previous cohorts at Exponential Impact and a lot of people who I've mentored over the years. You start a company, you really just want to create this machine that collects money, but some problems that I see pretty consistently is, one, the market really didn't pan out as fast as the founder thought. The product took longer to build than they thought. They missed their first forecast by 95%. Notice I didn't say they have 95% of their forecast. They missed it by 95%, which means they probably sold 1 or 2 licenses of the software, or they have 1 or 2 customers, which verifies that somebody's willing to take money out of their pocket and put it into your pocket. But the size of that market and the size of that pipeline didn't seem to pan out. And that usually translates to, I'm out of cash. And then you find that investors won't fund you anymore until you actually have customers. So there is often then a need to move from the platform to some semi-custom selling, some enterprise selling, some B2B selling, especially if you want to start off doing B2C. Now, we ran into all of these problems. And as I said, my co-founders were all engineers. And when we started in the basement, my co-founders all had these nice cushy folding tables and actual padded chairs. And at one point, kind of 9 months into us not having a minimal viable product, we started running out of cash. And so they said, okay, somebody has to sell this software. And by the way, somebody has to be a CEO, because we just were 4 engineers writing code. I will tell you, we were extremely naive. So you guys have a head start on getting some mentorship on this, but for the most part, we just thought we'd write code and people would buy it. So when they said, who's going to be our CEO? The 3 that you see on this picture all said, not me. And so I was the only one left. I had to start hitting the phones to call people to try to sell a product that we haven't even released yet. And because I was on the phone, they kicked me out of this gang room where they were all programming to put me in my own private office. And this was it, replete with water heaters and furnaces and repairmen. And I had to really buckle down and figure out, how do I actually move product? On top of that, my wife was a nurse and she was supporting us, and she wanted to quit nursing and go into law school. Kip, whose basement this is, he wanted to get married, and his fiance said, we're only getting married unless you kick those 4 guys out of the basement. Tom Basha, the guy with the beard, he had his first kid, and then Tom Walton just turned 30, and his wife wanted to start a family. Everybody around us said, you guys were nuts. We left HP. We actually spun off of Hewlett Packard. And at the time, they were a fairly premier technology company. But we spun out, and they said, you guys are nuts. So I had to figure out, either go back to HP with my tail in my, between my legs, or figure out to sell. And my partners remind me of this exact quote. And I wrote it on a Post-it note back then, and I still have it. Yes, we did have Post-it notes in 1991. But this was pretty much my mantra. So, what did that mean, learning to sell? Okay, there are thousands and thousands of books and classes on how to learn to sell. Most of them are just a bunch of BS, and they're pretty trivial, and they will not apply to what you're doing. But in every single one of them, there is a nugget. So I'm going to take the hundreds of books that I've read and classes that I've taken and narrow them down to just a few of them. And I'm going to give you a nugget from each. So you can leave here with some of these nuggets, but I would also recommend that you read some of these books. Okay, the first one was something called Green Light Selling. Again, silly. It almost, I think it might have been written by, you know, a used car salesman. But it took away one nugget that I think is really pretty important, and especially if you're a tech company. And that is, as you go and offer something to a potential customer, they are going to give you a string of objections. And with each one of those objections, as a tech company, and especially as an engineer, our first response is to then go back and solve that. Okay, so in our case, we had software, it ran on Unix workstations. The first person I tried to sell this to said, well, do you run on a Mac? And you know, my first reaction was, no, we don't run on a Mac. And I went back to my partners and said, we got to port this thing to the Mac. Okay. And then the next question is, well, do you have a library of components, pre-done components? So when I author this, I don't have to do everything from scratch. Oh, no, we don't. I'd go back and ask our team to do pre-built components. The premise of this book, the one useful nugget of it is this. When anybody gives you an objection and asks for something, what you do is you say, okay, no, we don't have that. But if we did have that, would you buy our software? And the answer is usually, well, no. Well, why not? Well, because then I have this second objection. And then you say, okay, if we did those first two things for you, would you buy our software? And the answer is, well, no. And then you get to the final item. So in my case, as my example, they kept saying, well, you need 3D components, you need libraries. And finally, they said, well, we can't buy software from a startup company. And I said, well, if we weren't a startup, would you be able to buy our software? And he said, yes. And so once you get that final yes, then you talk about and solve that last one, and they forget about all the previous objections. This is important when you're a startup because you can get into this rabbit hole of continually adding features until somebody buys your software. And it turns out you actually don't have to do that. You just have to find the one true stopping point. Okay, so that's from Green Light Selling. The second one was How to Be a Rainmaker, another relatively silly book. It almost feels like it's just a bunch of kind of lawyers and consultants telling you how to sell. But there were a couple of takeaways from there. I'll just tell you two that I liked. One was hurricanes don't count. So when you have a pipeline and you have somebody selling and they tell you why they didn't meet their quota or their objective, it doesn't matter what's happening around you. It doesn't matter that COVID hit. It doesn't matter that a hurricane hit. It doesn't matter that the power went out for a week. All you have to do is get your deal done. And that came from The Rainmaker. Now there actually are a bunch of these, so I would actually recommend this book. It is a super short, thin read, and you'll learn some things that you're going to use forever. The last one on this one was, whenever you have a meeting, especially with a customer, but even with your colleagues, before you end the meeting, you always ask one final question. Is there anything else we did not talk about? And often when people are ready to leave the meeting, they'll tell you what's really on their mind. So if you do anything, especially as a CEO, always end your meetings with asking that question. Okay. All right, so the third one is something called Crossing the Chasm. Has anybody out there read this book, Crossing the Chasm? I'm gonna look at my gallery view. Okay, Jose has read this book. Um,
I read the Spark Notes.
okay, that's close enough. I'm gonna give you a few more Spark Notes on this one as well. This is the Bible of technology selling. Okay, this was written the same year that we actually started our company. And what it does is it outlines for you how technology markets grow and what's important in each phase of that technology market. Okay, so in any new product or any new technology category, your customers are filled with initially technology enthusiasts. These are people that just love technology. Second, visionaries. Third, pragmatists. And fourth, mainstream buyers. Okay. You want to get into the mainstream here. This is where the volume is. This is where the money's made. This is where the platforms exist. But to get there, you have to get through the enthusiasts and the visionaries. And that cannot be sold as a platform. It cannot be marketed to. You have to actually figure out how to sell and get those people on board, because they're going to be your early adopters. They're going to be your first buyer, and they're going to be the references that you use to get to not only those customers in the mainstream, but the investors. Okay, so this also follows the investor pathway. Enthusiasts, that's going to be an angel investor will put money into something that a few enthusiasts will buy. VCs, visionaries. Okay, so they like it when you're in the visionary stage. Pragmatists and the mainstream, that's going to be your growth equity investors. They're going to have to see quite a bit of sales history, but they're going to pour fuel on the fire of your company. And the last one, which I didn't even point to because I really don't care about it, is called laggards. These are people that are at the end of the buying cycle, and that's where the private equity firms go and sort of scoop up a lot of times, just companies at the end of their life cycle. Okay, so the chasm, when they say crossing the chasm, is how do you jump from visionaries to pragmatists? This isn't just a continuous flow. There is a huge chasm that you have to get over to get from there. A lot of companies die in this visionary stage. There's usually a market with a ceiling. There are only so many visionaries, and they can't figure out, well, these visionaries love it. Why don't the pragmatists love it? This book gives you the answer to that. And it also is the shift in selling that I'll talk about here in a minute. Highly recommend this book. Get ready to dog ear it and put notes in it, and you will use it as a reference. Okay, so the next step is, I had to go from tricks of selling, like these one-liners, to actually creating a pipeline and figuring out how to get people through a very complex sales process that not only included the engineer or the buyer or the IT manager, but the CFO, the CEO, the entire corporation that I'm selling to. This book is excellent. And there's a follow-on book called Customer-Centric Selling, which is by the same author. Either one of those, they're actually the same. You can buy either one of those. But the key here is that the product deliverer or the service deliverer have to take control of the sales process. You cannot let the prospect take control of the sales process. They will lead you down a whole bunch of winding roads. People are not just waiting for you to sell them something that they didn't budget for or they have no plan of buying. So you have to lead them through that. And this book and the process of how to get there is quite powerful. This went from silly and one-liners to a true selling process that everybody selling technology and software should understand. Okay, so then the next book was the follow-on to Crossing the Chasm, called Inside the Tornado. It's by the same author, Jeffrey Moore. This is the platform book. right? So this is the recurring revenue start to that revolution. Any company that you point to say, hey, I want to be Google, or I want to be Uber, or I want to be Facebook, they all started with this book here. The new books that you see, like Exponential Impact and Platform Revolution, are analyzing the companies that followed inside the tornado. It's a very excellent book, but what it does is it is the transition from these early enterprise selling, the kind of selling where you have to actually physically sell, to this platform marketing world. And the interesting thing about it is these are two different worlds, right? So what you did in the visionary and enthusiast stage doesn't necessarily translate. And I'm just gonna kind of read a couple of differences here, right? So when you're in that early stage, which all of you are, you're gonna have to focus on the economic buyer and the end user, and you are going to have to approach the IT buyer, the infrastructure buyer later in the sales cycle. When you are in the mainstream, and you're trying to just sell as a platform, you have to ignore the economic buyer and just focus on the end user exclusively. In the early stages, you have to emphasize return on investment. In the later stages, you have to emphasize timely deployment of an infrastructure. In the early stages, you have to avoid competition and just gain a niche market. You have to go to a place that nobody's been to. In the platform stage, you have to attack competition and gain mass market share as aggressively as possible. And in the early stage, you want to really focus your product on a vertical market, right? So for us as Altea, we started off focusing only on automotive, and you do everything great, and you solve all of their problems. In the second stage, the tornado stage or the platform stage, you have to position your product as a horizontal product across many, many industries, and create a global infrastructure to deliver it. So a lot of interesting things in that book. Okay, so the last one that I would recommend very highly is a book called The Hard Thing About Hard Things, written by Ben Horowitz and Mark Andreessen. All right, so these guys, Mark Andreessen, founder of Netscape, they're the VCs in Silicon Valley that really, really, I think, get it, and they really, really get entrepreneurs, and they were entrepreneurs themselves. Excellent read. Has anybody read this book? Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but one of the takeaways on sales is when you're in this pre-mainstream phase, what Mark Andreessen says is the two most important leaders in your company are the VP of sales and the VP of engineering. You can actually make money and survive if those two leaders are excellent. Now, many of you in this room might be playing the role of each of those, and man, if you're in that stage, you have to focus on those two parts of your business. The other stuff will come, but if you don't generate cash flow and customers, you're not going to survive. So I will come back to that. But here's basically the summary that I just talked about, of these 6 books. Prakar, I'll send you this presentation, so people don't have to scramble to jot it down.
Also, thank you. It's also recorded, so they can also watch this recording. But yes, thank you. That'd be great.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so so that is just some reference material, which again I'd highly recommend. A couple of more items that I want to talk to you about, and then I want to open the floor to questions from there. Okay. The next topic is persuasion versus reasoning. Okay. Um, or, as I like to call it, why engineers naturally suck at selling. Reasoning and logic is probably the worst way to sell anything. Although we as technologists and engineers and finance people think if we just give people really good logical reasons, we give them a nice ROI, they've got to buy. And if they don't, they're idiots, right? Well, what we've discovered and are discovering more and more as time goes on, and as bots and algorithms are persuading people to do things they thought they would never do, much of it nefarious, but generally there's a lot of great reasons to persuade people and do it ethically. The bottom line here is, again, if you're creating new technology or a new product and you're a new company, you are presenting to someone something they never thought of that even existed. Their head was already full of everything they were going to do with their money. And so in order for you to crack that code, you have to first open their mind and have them actually listen. You have to create credibility. You have to have empathy for their problem. You have to have empathy for who they are. You have to touch the brainstem, which includes everything from love and fear and joy. And most importantly, you have to create trust. And none of this is naturally in the engineer's lexicon. It's not in their DNA. Now, the good news is you can learn it. You can learn how to do that. You can learn how to make that actually work for you and work for your customer. You may feel like what I'm telling you is really about manipulation, and it can be, right? There are a lot of ways to manipulate people and trick them into doing something that's not good for them or something they don't want to do. However, you as an ethical CEO or ethical salesperson in a new tech company know that what you're going to do is make their life better. And make their life better is not a logical thing in many cases. Again, there's an ROI, there's a pro-con comparison to what they're doing now and what they're going to do differently. But there's also a way that they're going to feel like they're better off today than they were yesterday, or better off tomorrow than they'll be today. In our case, our software is really productivity software. And many of our customers prior to Altea coming to us had to hand code graphic software to get it to run on these really restrictive hardware platforms. Right? So our customers don't use Qualcomms and Intels. They use these tiny little microcontrollers that have to run on a watch-sized battery, and it just really has no compute power. The only way they could get a compelling GUI onto those devices is to hand code it with a dozen engineers. And those dozen engineers were typically pulling all-nighters. With our software, they get much higher quality GUIs, and they get a lot more time and a lot more free time, not only to do interesting things at their company, but to spend time with their families. That's opening their mind and enabling a reason for them to listen to you and to care. And if you get that, then you'll go a long way. And by the way, it's not just your customers. You have to persuade your spouse that this company is a really good idea. You have to persuade your kids that I'm going to miss their soccer game because this is what I'm doing. You have to persuade investors. And investors seem very logical, they seem very money driven, and they certainly are, but you have to hit something emotional, otherwise they don't care. Okay, a second topic is persuasion versus selling. As I've said, there's a persuasion part to what we need to do to get people to change their ways, and that is to open their mind before we can pour something into it. Then there's a selling part. The selling part is how do you get them to open their wallet? How do you get them to take money out of their pocket and put it into your pocket? Now, there are a lot of people that are really good at persuasion, and there are a lot of people that are really good at selling. There are very few people that are good at both. So if you're right now trying to figure out, okay, how do I generate some cash here by actually going to a customer? You're going to have to find a salesperson, or you're going to have to be a salesperson. And those people know how to get money, and they have to get money, otherwise they don't get paid. They don't get paid their commission. But many of them are not good at persuading. So guess whose job that is? That's your job as the CEO. You are the primary salesperson, but you're really not. You're the primary evangelist, and you persuade people to do what they're going to do. Now, when you hire that salesperson, or you hire that VP of sales that actually goes and gets money, you're going to find early on at the visionary stage or at the technology enthusiast stage that you're doing all the work, right? You're like, wait a minute, I'm the one doing all the selling. No, you're not. You're doing all the persuading, which is really valuable. And you two are teaming up to generate a pipeline and generate money. If you can find somebody that's good at both, snag them and pay them whatever they want. They're gonna change your company. Okay, so that's the last topic. Well, there is one more topic that I want to talk about, and I want to go back to the book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. It's not so much about selling, although there's a component to it, but this is about you as an entrepreneur. One thing that Ben Horowitz talks about is what he calls the struggle. The struggle is what you go through to get from zero to getting a paycheck and actually feel like you're not an imposter and you didn't make the biggest mistake in your life. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read to you a list of a dozen things that will prove that you're in the struggle. And think about whether these things ring true for you, and I'll be happy to talk about them because I've been through every single one of these. So the struggle is when you wonder why you started the company in the first place. The struggle is when people ask you, why don't you just quit and get a job? And you actually don't know the answer. The struggle is when your employees think that you are lying to them and you think they actually might be right. The struggle is when food loses its taste. The struggle is when you don't believe you should be the CEO of your company. The struggle is when you know that you are in over your head and you know you cannot be replaced. The struggle is when everybody thinks you're an idiot, but nobody will fire you. The struggle is where self-doubt becomes self-hatred. The struggle is when you're having conversation with somebody and you can't hear a word that they're saying because all you're thinking about is your struggle. The struggle is when you want the pain to stop, and the struggle is unhappiness. The struggle is when you go on vacation to feel better and you actually feel worse. The struggle is when you are surrounded by people and you feel like you're all alone. The struggle has no mercy. The struggle is a cold sweat. The struggle, though, is not failure, but the struggle does cause failure, especially if you are weak. And it always causes failure if you are weak. When you're in the struggle, nothing is easy and nothing feels right. You're going to feel the struggle more when you engage in selling, because that is where everything meets the road. That is how you actually survive. So the only thing, that you can take away that says, I'm not alone, is that every entrepreneur has gone through this. Everybody from Steve Jobs to Mark Zuckerberg has been through this struggle. That doesn't mean you're going to make it, but you at least know what you're in and you know why you're there. It's also where greatness comes from. And so you're doing something not many people have done. It's rarefied air, and you should embrace the struggle and embrace all of your mistakes and move on, because you're the only one that can do it. So that's it. I'd love to go back to sales. I'd love to answer any questions, create any discussion, get any reaction from you as to what I've presented so far.